All right, hello everyone, and welcome to our Clean Water Webinar Wednesday series. We are really excited to be able to offer these webinars to our monitors, friends, and our clean water community as a chance to learn about clean water issues and stay connected. I'm Rebecca Shore, the Save Our Streams coordinator, and I have a few housekeeping items to review before I turn things over to Jared. So first of all, this webinar is being recorded. It'll be available on the Izaak Walton League YouTube channel in a few days. Keep an eye on our website at iwla.org for more information on recordings and our upcoming webinars in our series. Second, if you have a question during the presentation, you can type it and send it from the GoToWebinar chat box. We'll have time for Q&A at the end of the presentation. The webinar should run for about an hour, though we can stay for a few extra minutes if there's any lingering questions, or we'll send follow-up answers at the end of the webinar. So today's presenter is Jared Mott, the National Conservation Director at the Izaak Walton League of America. He leads planning and implementation of the League's conservation work, including developing a national legislative and public policy agenda and engaging grassroots advocates in support of this effort. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Jared, and he's going to talk to us about the Clean Water Act and the new Waters of the United States rule.
All right, thanks, Rebecca. Hey, everybody. First of all, just want to say that I hope everybody is staying home and staying safe, and that, you know, this is mostly from a presentation that I gave to our board, to the Izaak Walton League's board in February, and it utilizes information from the league and from a host of other conservation environmental groups like Trout Unlimited and NRDC and TRCP and a bunch of our partners in this fight to protect the Clean Water Act. And the other thing that I'm going to mention right up front here is that since I've got this captive audience here, you're going to notice a theme of a bunch of fishing pictures. You're here so I can make you look at pictures of fish that I've caught, but the other reason that I wanted to include that is to kind of give this presentation a little bit of a theme and a little bit more real-world demonstration of why the Clean Water Act matters to me in a very personal way. And so, with all of that said, pitter patter, let's get at her. So, our first slide here, we're going to be talking about the Clean Water Act and recent actions that have been undertaken by the Environmental Protection Agency and the Army Corps of Engineers to weaken the Clean Water Act, which of course is one of our bedrock environmental laws. And so we're going to talk a little bit about what's different and why it just doesn't quite add up. And the first thing that you need to understand is the definition of something called the United States. From here on out, you're probably going to hear me call it WOTUS, just because waters of the United States takes a long time to say. But what WOTUS means is very simply, it's just the waters in this country that are protected by the Clean Water Act. When Congress wrote the Clean Water Act, they understood that this kind of broad piece of legislation couldn't cover every conceivable water body within the United States. And so what they did was they applied it very specifically to what they defined as waters of the United States. And just very simply, that just means the waters, the rivers, the lakes, the streams, the wetlands that the Clean Water Act applies to, that the act has jurisdiction over. And obviously, if some waters are waters of the United States, others are not. And that's the crux of this whole issue, is how far does the jurisdiction of the Clean Water Act go? And so what's being done right now is we're pulling back. We're seeing a pulling back of the definition of WOTUS and what waters are protected by the Clean Water Act. And so this regulation to redefine WOTUS has been in the works pretty much since the inauguration of the current Trump administration. I believe that the president issued an executive order in February. So within a month of being inaugurated, the administration was moving forward to pull these protections back, and that rule was finalized this past January. And just so we're keeping up, this is a big old bull red that I caught inshore right off the Mississippi River in South Louisiana. The Mississippi River, I grew up on the Mississippi River. It means a lot to me. And, you know, the wetlands and the water bodies that, you know, feed the Mississippi obviously are really important to species like redfish, and the economy in South Louisiana is incredibly tied up in the recreational fishing industry. So that's the South Louisiana red, and we'll keep going here. So with the new definition of waters of the United States, so what's in and what's out? The main thing that you need to remember when it comes to what is protected and what is not protected is that the Clean Water Act will now apply to streams that flow intermittently, but not apply to streams that flow ephemerally. And just real basically, both of those are streams that don't flow all year long. They don't have continuous flow, but an intermittent stream doesn't flow all year long, but is connected to either a rising and falling of the water table or something like melting snowpack. And an ephemeral stream is tied exclusively to precipitation events. So you're probably familiar, you probably know a little stream near your house that, you know, is dry almost all of the year, but every time it rains, it has some water in it that is flowing, and those are ephemeral streams. And under this regulation, those are no longer protected by the Clean Water Act. The new rule also applies to wetlands and kind of dramatically pulls back the protection for wetlands in this country. After this rule is finalized, now the Clean Water Act only applies to wetlands that have a continuous surface connection to a protected water body. So if it's a wetland that's connected to a river or something like that, or, you know, to the bay or the ocean or something like that, it is still under the protection of the Clean Water Act. But if it's what we call an isolated wetland, then it is no longer protected by the act. And some of the best examples of those are prairie potholes. You see a picture here of a prairie pothole that, you know, obviously these are, if you're not familiar, prairie potholes are very important for breeding waterfowl, and they're kind of the heartbeat of all four of the major North American flyways. And you know, I'm a duck hunter, and so they obviously mean a lot to me. And so this photo is an example of a prairie pothole. I took this photo back in 2007, the first time I ever made a trip up to the prairies. This is in South Dakota. And the other image you see here is just a simple illustration of the streams that are protected. If you can imagine how, you know, a lot of times with mountain ranges, you have a dry side and a wet side. You'll have the mountains will cause a rain shadow. So on the wet side of the mountain, you'll have these streams that flow after precipitation events, these ephemeral streams. Those streams are no longer protected. While on the dry side of the mountain, you'll have streams that are mostly fed by snowpack. And so, you know, those streams are intermittent and are still protected. But what you can see looking at this, you know, this little illustration here is that, of course, both of these streams flow to the same place. So, if, you know, whether you pollute the intermittent stream or whether you pollute in the ephemeral stream, that pollution is going to wind up in the same place. So we're going to talk briefly about the kind of the 5 main problems with the new WOTUS regulation. Got them right up here for you to see. But mostly, you know, this is just ill-conceived. It ignores the weight of scientific evidence. It doesn't pass legal muster, and it relies on vague terminology, and we don't know how it's going to affect. So we'll briefly go through each of those. This is a photo, high alpine wetlands. Look how happy this guy looks, right? I don't know why I was smiling so much. I could hardly breathe. That was about 12,000 feet in the Colorado wilderness. We were fly fishing for native cutthroat trout. on these high alpine wetlands and little tiny streams that are now going to be faced with losing their protections. So starting at the top here, ill-conceived. The first thing to consider when we talk about why this regulation is ill-conceived is that the United States has not achieved the goals of the Clean Water Act, which, for as an extensive piece of legislation as it is, has pretty simple goals, and that's that we're going to make all of the waters in the United States fishable and swimmable. We haven't gotten there. And in fact, we don't even know how far we are from getting there. Only 53% of of the assessed streams in this country, only 53% don't meet water quality standards. And those are just the assessed streams. We're not monitoring every stream. Obviously, the Izaak Walton League is trying to get as many monitors onto as many of those streams as we can. But moving down the list here, of the assessed lakes, reservoirs, and ponds, 71% are not meeting state water quality standards. And again, 80% of assessed bays and estuaries fall short of the standards. So what you see here is this domino effect of pollution, and as it comes from upstream to the places downstream, of the assessed streams, 53% don't meet, about half don't meet state water quality standards. All right, so some streams are being polluted, some are not. But then we see that lakes, reservoirs, and ponds, we see a higher percentage that don't meet water quality standards. And then again, an even higher percentage as we move into bays and estuaries. What you're seeing there is just that pollution moving downstream. And that's why it's important to protect all of the small streams, all of the headwater, all of the tributary streams, and isolated wetlands at the upper end of the watershed. Speaking of the upper end of the watershed, this is a black drum, again from South Louisiana, which is the very bottom of the watershed. But like we said, 80% of assessed bays and estuaries. This is from the other side of Louisiana. I caught this drum fishing with my wife's cousin's husband in Vermilion Bay. And again, you're looking at the very bottom of a watershed that has pollution coming all the way up from Canadian provinces down down the Mississippi into the Atchafalaya into Vermilion Bay. Ignores the way to scientific evidence. Obviously it's hard to stress too much how important streams and wetlands are to the health of downstream water bodies. We just talked about that a little bit, and you see that ladder of pollution as it accumulates downstream. In 2012, the EPA commissioned a report called the Connectivity Report that got the input of scientists from all over the country, looked at over 1,200 peer-reviewed studies that basically confirmed exactly what that first bullet says, which seems like common sense, but the scientific backing is there for this, and that's just that, like we said, streams and wetlands are extraordinarily crucial to the health of our downstream water bodies. So fast forward to now, and the EPA is putting forth this new definition of WOTUS, this new regulation, and they have their own panel of scientific advisors, the scientific advisory panel. And the EPA has always had this, or not always, but for a long time has had this. And each administrator of the EPA appoints new members of the panel as members rotate off. And so it's important to note that this panel has members from this appointed by this administration. And that's important because those scientific advisors warned that this rule flunks, and that is their word, not mine, that this rule flunks basic science and potentially introduces new risks to human health and environmental health. We talk a lot about environmental health, and we talked about that ladder of pollution coming downstream, but it's important to note that this has serious risks for human health as well, A third of Americans get their drinking water from sources that are fed, at least in part, by some of these small streams that don't flow all year. And so, that pollution is going to work its way downstream if we remove those protections. And we're going to have to really pay attention to what's in our drinking water. I live in Northern Virginia. My drinking water source is the Potomac River. It is absolutely fed by some of these streams that will lose protections. We've mapped it, we've looked at it, and we'll get to some of those maps here in a little bit. And moving on, I'd like to point out to folks, this is a wild, not a hatchery. This is a wild king salmon that I caught on the Columbia River. Salmon on the Columbia are facing a whole lot of problems. Most of them are dams, sea lions, but we've spent billions. We as taxpayers in America spent billions of dollars to try and mitigate that, to try and mitigate some of these historic salmon runs on the Columbia and the Snake and northwestern U.S. up there. But what happens to our investment, the $1 billion investment? If the water just isn't clean enough. Salmon depend, on pretty cold, clean water, and we're doing all this mitigation work to try and get them up and over dams, and make sure they aren't all eaten by predators. But what if the water's just not clean enough? How many small streams feed the Columbia? Also, this rule doesn't pass legal muster. There's a whole lot of kind of arcane and complicated language around the Clean Water Act and why this rule is in play, why we feel collectively, why as Americans are we constantly defining and redefining WOTUS. It all stems from a few court cases that the Supreme Court ruled on starting in 2001, and then kind of subsequent follow-up cases. But this rule in particular, this EPA's definition of waters of the United States, relies on a legal theory that no court in the country has ever accepted. And that theory comes from Justice Antonin Scalia's dissent in the Rapanos case, which was in 2009. Now, a majority of the Supreme Court in that case, the Rapanos case, have rejected Justice Scalia's theory, which was that water must flow continuously in order to be protected by the Clean Water Act. And so this rule obviously doesn't go as far as Justice Scalia's dissent did, but that is the basis that this rule is framed around. And it's important to remember that, again, no court has accepted this theory. And so that makes a lot of sense if you go back to the original text of the Clean Water Act, which, as we said before, there's a lot of stuff in there, but it boils down to fishable and swimmable. The Clean Water Act recognizes that the health of downstream waters depends on the health of upstream waters. And there's going to be a ton of litigation over this new rule, and we're going to be in a brave new world here. But I think that the important thing to remember going forward is that we're in uncharted waters here, because we've never seen a rule based on, or a definition of WOTUS based on a legal theory that's just never been accepted at all. Before we move on, I'm sure everybody probably recognizes the old striper. That's a striped bass from the Indian River in Delaware. Funny thing about stripers and a bunch of other fish, they're anadromous, so they migrate between the ocean and freshwater, and so they depend on an entire system. Freshwater, estuary, and marine systems all have to function together to support a healthy striped bass fishery. So one of the other problems here is this, relies on vague terminology. What does that mean? It's going to be nearly impossible to implement in the real world, because the language from the rule says that when you go to classify a stream as either intermittent or ephemeral, no, it doesn't flow all year long. So it's one of those. We've got that figured out. But how do we know if it's intermittent or if it's ephemeral? You know, is it an intermittent stream that, we're just in a drought and so it's not flowing except after rain, or is it an ephemeral stream? And this sort of definition is going to matter, right? Because it's going to decide whether or not it is subject to the jurisdiction of the Clean Water Act. But the vague terminology in the rule to evaluate the characteristics of those streams says to do so, quote, at times that are not too wet or not too dry, quote. So we're sort of left to try and determine, how do we determine, much less enforce, this sort of magical Goldilocks standard of, neither too wet nor too dry, and then just throw in there that, it has to be based on a typical year. Not too wet or not too dry, based on the typical year. So here in Northern Virginia, whatever the typical year looks like in terms of precipitation, it's neither not too wet or not too dry. So how are we to interpret that? How are we to enforce that just mess of vague terminology? And the answer, at least not effectively. And to sort of demonstrate what we're dealing with here, we've got a map that, the league has created of the streams around Lincoln, Nebraska. And what you see here are a handful of blue streams. Those are the perennial streams. They flow all year long. All of those red lines are streams that either flow intermittently or ephemerally. The other problem with ephemeral streams, just as a quick aside, is that we haven't mapped most of them, especially in the east. But with this map, all of these red lines are streams that don't flow all year, which means that we need to know, okay, is this an ephemeral stream or is this an intermittent stream? And it matters as it relates to the jurisdiction of the Clean Water Act. So what's a typical year, too wet or too dry, around Lincoln, Nebraska? Because all of these red lines on this map, protection of all of those streams is going to depend on sorting out, this, what I call this Goldilocks standard of just right. But the thing, of course, that you notice that you just can't get away from, even as you look at this map and ponder the ridiculousness of trying to figure out what all this language means, is that whether it's too wet a year or too dry a year or intermittent or ephemeral, all of those red lines flow to blue lines. And this is something that we're going to just keep coming back to, is whether they're intermittent or ephemeral, upstream tributary streams flow to perennial streams that flow to rivers, that flow to our lakes, that flow to our, bays and estuaries. And so, whether the pollution in our rivers comes from an ephemeral stream as opposed to an intermittent stream doesn't change a whole lot to, somebody who's drinking water and is now polluted. And finally, the EPA and the Corps, the reason this rule doesn't add up is the EPA and the Army Corps of Engineers, they don't know what's going to happen. And they say this. Agencies say they do not know how the condition of the nation's waters will be affected by implementing this change. And when I first read that, right on the second bullet, it's just kind of, wait, what? Because how is that not the first question that you try and answer when you're considering this kind of policy change? Now, the reason they say that they don't know how the condition of the nation's waters will be affected is this is them trying to get around the National Environmental Policy Act, which requires an economic analysis of implementing this rule. And, you know, this was how they were trying to say, well, we can't possibly do that because we're not sure how removing protections for some of these upstream waters is going to affect downstream. Well, what? That don't make no sense. So if we're not sure the downstream effects, what is going to flow unchecked? That's what we don't know. And because of this, we can't estimate how much pollution is going to flow into our water bodies, which means that the full economic costs of implementing this rule cannot be examined. But what we do know is that the outdoor recreation economy, small piece of which is all these fish picks we're looking at, the outdoor recreation economy pumps in $887 billion, billion with a B, every single year. So hunting, fishing, boating, paddling, swimming, bird watching, all of it, skiing, all of it. $887 billion. We know what's at stake, even if we don't know the full economic costs. But if we don't even know what's going to happen, how are we moving forward with this? And so, you know, those are 5 of the main reasons that this new definition of waters of the United States doesn't make sense. And one of the things that you'll hear as a way to kind of prop up what the EPA and the Corps are doing here is like, don't worry about it. The states are going to pick up the slack. You know, the Clean Water Act is, you know, it was written to be, you know, an exercise in federalism, right? The states have an important role to play, keeping waters, protecting waters from pollution under the Clean Water Act. That much is certain. But the Clean Water Act, the federal act, the federal rules, those waters of the United States, not the waters of Virginia, not the waters of Rhode Island, not the waters of Colorado, the waters of the United States is a floor, right? That's a regulatory floor, like that no state can go under. So whether you're in South Dakota or Louisiana or Nevada or wherever you may be, there's this floor of protection that your water will be at least this clean because it is a water of the United States. And so one of something you'll hear from the proponents of this new regulation is that don't worry about it. The states are going to pick up the slack here. Well, that's just not true, because the states can't pass laws that are less stringent than, you know, they can't have clean water regulations that are less stringent than the federal regulations, but that doesn't mean that they're going to, you know, pick up the slack or pass more stringent regulations just because the feds move that floor down a notch or two. And so what we did was we put together a map of states that, based on their state regulations, would lose some form of clean water protections under this new definition of water. So what you're looking at here is the states that are highlighted in red are states that either don't have state regulations protecting ephemeral streams or isolated wetlands or something like that. And so that what happens when the feds remove those protections, they're removed in these states as well. And so, you know, there's a couple paths forward here, right? You know, the states could say, oh, well, this is a problem, and so we need to issue new regulations that will protect isolated wetlands or issue new regulations that will protect ephemeral streams. But that's unlikely. Some states will probably do that. There'll be a couple or a handful that may do that. But we've seen what happens when, you know, some states have looked at the costs of even before this rule, looked at the costs of, regulating these waters, these smaller streams, these isolated wetlands, and found it to be prohibitive. There was a study in Montana where they did just that. And so, just saying that the states are going to pick up the slack, that's not good enough, right? We know that all of these states that are highlighted here are not going to necessarily, pass new regulations that will pick up that slack. And so you may be sitting there, like I am in Virginia, and see, well, my state's not highlighted in red, so, I'll be fine. So what this is what happens when you also highlight the states and color in the states that are downstream of states that will lose protections, because we've talked about, we've got that pollution ladder. It just builds as it flows downstream, right? So we add in those states, we see, okay, the state is either going to lose protections or is downstream of a state that will lose protections. Now, what are we looking at? That's a more accurate picture of, what we're dealing with as it relates to our clean water here. And as you can see here, unless you're up in New England, in this little corner of the country, this is going to be bad news for your drinking water, for the streams that you fish in, the rivers that you fish in, and so this matters to everybody. And this is where I finished my presentation in February. A lot of time talking about streams and ephemeral and intermittent, and I spent a lot of time talking about fish and fish and stuff. I'm probably am anything more than I am a fisherman, and I put this photo in here because this is sunrise on a prairie pothole that I was duck hunting on my first trip to the prairies in 2007, and it was great. It was an incredible experience, and I've been back to this part of the world several times since that first trip. And the reason I have this photo in here is because that wetland's not there anymore. I've been back to it, and it was there in 2007, and we hunted it. We had a good hunt, and then when I came back, I can't remember what year it was, 2011, 2012, during the big tile boom in South Dakota, it was tile drained, so it's no longer there, and that was with stronger protections in place. So if we remove those protections completely, what are we looking at going forward? We don't know, because the EPA and the Corps have told us that we don't know. But we know that it's probably not going to be good for duck hunters. It's probably not going to be good for anglers. It's not going to be good for our drinking water. And so with that, I will take some questions. You can see my contact info there. Finally, I tried to post a bunch of pictures of me holding big fish. Why this all really matters is up there. That's Eli. He's my nephew. He's already a better fisherman. But he's into it. He loves to fish. He's 5 years old, or he's about to be 5 years old, and he's remarkably good at hanging out in a boat and fishing. And he asked to go fishing whenever we hang out at my father's house, his grandfather's house. There's a little pond down the way, and he's ate up with it. And so, where's he gonna fish? Where's he gonna duck hunt? What water is he gonna drink? That's why this matters to me. So with that, I will try and answer any questions that folks have. But that concludes the presentation part of this webinar.
All right, thank you, Jared. It's definitely sobering, but really important stuff to talk about, I think, especially in these times when a lot of us are thinking about other urgent issues. This is an issue that's going to continue to be important months and years down the road. So we do have some questions that have come in, and feel free to keep submitting those as we do the Q&A portion here. Our first question is sort of I feel like kind of the most basic one, which is essentially if the Clean Water Act was already not achieving the intended goals as it was created, what was the goal of the rollbacks? Was it ostensibly to help with perceived burden on legislation? What was the rationale to roll back these regulations if the original act already wasn't achieving the 100% swimmable and fishable waters goal?
That's a good question. I don't have a very good answer for it. There are populations in this country that wanted to see Clean Water Act protections rolled back. You hear a lot about agriculture, a lot about builders and developers and stuff like that felt that the Clean Water Act, and especially the new definitions that was proposed by the new definition of WOTUS that was proposed by the previous administration, the Obama administration, they felt that it went too far. The regulations were going to be too onerous on them and their business activities. And so, you had these populations of folks looking for a rollback of those protections. I don't, that's as much of an answer as I can give. I don't know the answer to, the kind of grander, but fishable and swimmable. We're obviously not there. Well, I guess we were too close.
Yeah. And another question was about what exactly will the damage be to ephemeral streams? What kind of pollution might we see affecting these streams? They are small and they're not year round. So what could be some of the threats that they're going to start to face more specifically?
The list is long but distinguished, as Goose would say in Top Gun. Anything. So the way the Clean Water Act works is, under Section 404, which is the piece that we're talking about here. In order to discharge is the word that the act uses, pollution, dredge and fill, any of these activities that are, kind of the code words within the Clean Water Act, you need a federal permit. So an example of that would be if I was going to, let's say I'm a developer, right? And I was going to build a development over there somewhere. And then off to one side of where I'm going to build my development, there is an ephemeral stream. It only flows after it rains. It's an ephemeral stream, but it flows down to an intermittent stream that flows to a perennial stream that flows to the Potomac River. If I'm that developer and I start, clearing the ground, cutting a bunch of trees down, driving a bunch of bulldozers around, moving a bunch of dirt, building houses, if I'm going to discharge anything like dirt that we know runs off of construction sites into this stream under the Clean Water Act, I need a permit to do that. And so the EPA could, actually you get the permit from the Corps of Engineers. The Corps could deny me that permit. That's pretty rare. But one of the other things they could do is they could put limitations on that permit. So we're going to issue this permit, but you gotta put up silt fencing to try and mitigate the runoff going down into this ephemeral stream. So that's a real world example of, what can happen to these ephemeral streams is you just get runoff from a construction site. Those of us that live in, fairly urban and suburban areas are pretty used to seeing streams run orange or brown after it rains. So that's kind of a real world example, but it could be anything. If I wanted to dump arsenic into the ephemeral stream, the pollutant, the discharge is what is regulated under the Clean Water Act, not what the actual discharge is. It's just discharge. Now, I'm sure there's some federal regulation, some other federal regulation that talks about discharge of arsenic, but in terms of the Clean Water Act, the discharge could be anything. But silt runoff is a pretty common real world example.
Great. We did have a question specifically about the wetlands, especially where the number that half of all wetlands might or will lose protection from the new ruling. And we also had a question about the Swank decision, SWANCC, and so did that already have some role? Can you give a little background about that decision, and then if that already had a role in designating which wetlands have protection?
Yeah, so it did, and that's kind of what kicked off all of this. You heard me allude to, kind of earlier Supreme Court decisions. Swank was the 2001 decision that kicked all this off. Solid Waste Associated, something of Northern Cook County disposal. It was, so the solid waste folks in the Chicago area had a few gravel pits that they wanted to do something with, and there was somebody took them to court to try and keep them from doing it because they said that wildlife used those pits, and that was true. And at that time, there was something called the migratory bird rule, which said that if a wetland was, and I'm paraphrasing here, but basically said that if a wetland was habitat for migratory birds, it was considered a water of the United States. And so Swank it got litigated all the way up to the Supreme Court, and Swank was the decision that was issued in 2001 that said, no, just because a wetland is, habitat for migratory birds does not make it a water of the United States. And so that was sort of the first domino to fall, right? Is then, okay, well, if we're opening up the box and looking at, we're really looking under the hood here of what is considered a water of the United States, and there it was. We were off to the races. So, the 51% number comes from, I didn't do the analysis, but it's pretty well accepted that when you look at the wetlands in this country, about half of them, a little over half of them, do not have a continuous surface connection to that kind of larger protected water body. They're isolated wetlands. I use the example of Prairie potholes. There's several others, and some that would surprise you, honestly. Playa lakes, probably that's not surprising. Vernal pools in different parts of the country, but then some of theirs aren't as surprising. But some of them, parts of Big Cypress Preserve down in Florida, will lose protection under this rule because it's technically an isolated wetland. It's a big isolated wetland that everybody knows, but it's still an isolated wetland. So, that the 51% number just comes from looking across this country at what our wetlands look like, and about half of them, a little over, are isolated.
Awesome, thank you. We did have a question, and I actually have a link that I'll put into the chat box, but if you have any more information about where folks can find the specific water quality standards that lakes, reservoirs, streams are supposed to meet under the current Clean Water Act. So I'm putting a link in the chat box as well. But Jared, I don't know if you have any other resources that you know of off the top of your head.
Not really off the top of my head. Again, some of it is going to depend on, the states. But we'll come up with some links that we can pass out. But off the top of my head, not really. And then you're going to have standards for what for drinking water, for whatever the case may be. We've mostly been talking about Section 404 of the Clean Water Act. There's obviously a bunch of other ones too that are important for regulating what's going into the water.
Right. Yeah, we can definitely hunt down some of those links and send those out. There will be a follow-up email tomorrow with information about the recording as well. So we'll be sure to share those in that email. We've had quite a few questions, not surprisingly, about what legal challenging has been done about WOTUS. So are there groups, are there states, are there plans to challenge this new ruling? And sort of along with that, what can we do? Is there anything that we as citizens, as advocates can do to advocate to our states, to our local government, to our federal government? A lot of people are now we're riled up, but what do we do about it?
Sure. There's a bunch of things you can do. Unfortunately, one of the things that you can't do is comment on the proposed, it's finalized now. You can't comment on the rule. It's been finalized. The time for commenting has passed. So unfortunately, that avenue is no longer available. There will be legal challenges. None have been filed yet. That's largely a result of the process of the bureaucracy, right? So, like I said, this rule goes all the way back to the beginning of the administration. We worked through different iterations of rulemaking and commenting and all this sort of different stuff, and we finally got a final rule issued, a draft final rule issued in January. And so now the administration is supposed to issue a final rule. And they just haven't done it yet. So nobody really knows why. Other stuff going on, impeachment, COVID-19, all this other stuff. Who knows? But normally you see that final rule published within a month or so of the draft, which again was in January, but we just haven't seen it. And so that's a long bureaucratic answer to why you haven't seen a lawsuit yet. It's technically not something to litigate. But once that rule is final, you're going to see those lawsuits drop. So what can you do? Almost anything else. The most important thing that you can do and that I can do is continue to make noise about this to whomever has a responsibility over our waters, or whomever has a responsibility to you as a constituent. So obviously you can get in touch with your elected officials from local level all the way up to the congressional level and say, this is unacceptable in this country. We're not going to go backwards on Clean Water Act protections. And you can ask them to help protect clean water, and they can pass local ordinances. The states we talked about can come up with new regulations to protect the waters that are now being left unprotected. And then ultimately, I think that if we're just in the fever dream and having the ultimate what does success look like, Congress would go back and they'd reopen the Clean Water Act, and they would say pretty specifically what constitutes a water of the United States. And so you can let your members of Congress know that you think these waters ought to be protected. I think that's an important thing that folks need to do.
Yeah, I think a lot of folks might not realize just how powerful it is to pick up the phone and call, or, send emails, send letters. It's a lot more effective than I think a lot of people might feel like. And something that the Izaak Walton League, we provide on our website, you can actually sign up for our Conservation Currents newsletter, which also provides action alerts. And these are really easy ways that you get a notice about something that's in Congress right now and an action you can take. There's a form letter, you can edit as you like, and that's a really easy way to have sort of a feed about what's going on in the legislature right now and how you can comment and make your voice heard. The last question that we have here is something that sort of relates to that, which is, with your work in the Izaak Walton League, what did the league do during the comment period? And, does the league have plans about the Clean Water Act and WOTUS, and sort of what were the actions that we took, and, how are we sort of hopefully leading the charge in protecting clean water?
Well, so it's twofold, right? There's kind of parallel tracks. Specifically on the advocacy track, which I imagine is what is being asked about here. We were engaged every step of the way. We submitted, as an organization, we submitted comments every step of the way. Again, I mentioned earlier that this was this kind of bureaucratic regulatory process, and so it had all these steps, because the first thing the administration had to do was repeal the old definition of waters of the United States. And so, we commented on that and, fought that. And then the administration had to replace the definition of waters of the United States with their definition, which is, what they've just finalized. And, we commented on that, and, we fought against that. And so in addition to kind of submitting our own comments, we joined in, we signed on to joint comments with other organizations that are committed to defending clean water. And, the diversity of the groups that we worked with in this fight is pretty incredible. Sportsmen's groups, that's my background. That's where I come from. That's what I'm the most familiar with. But I mean, all the way to, environmental groups and everything in between. We joined other letters. We submitted our own comments. We sent action alerts to our members, asking, to make it easy for them to submit comments. So we had, our own members and folks that get, like Rebecca was talking about earlier, or get our action alerts, which isn't just members. But, we sent out alerts saying, hey, it's important. This is important. Get your comments in. Provided comments, that folks could send in. And so we were engaged on that front. I went to several meetings at the Office of Management and Budget, which sounds ridiculous and highly bureaucratic, and it's the most bureaucratic of all the bureaucracies, it seems. But they have an important role to play in this regulatory process of examining the costs of proposed regulations and stuff like that. And so, I went into meetings with them, highlighting basically what we talked about earlier, that, the full costs of this regulation, there's no way that we can know them, because we don't know what this is going to do to pollution in the downstream waters that's coming from these newly unprotected streams and wetlands. Yeah, we did all kinds of stuff. We had all sorts of, clean water minutes and stuff like that, where we filmed, just little short videos to try and send out, to our members, out to the universe, talking about the importance of this, making sure that folks would get their comments in. So it wasn't just, folks that got an email from us. If it was someone that just happened to stumble upon our Facebook page or Instagram page or Twitter, whatever the case may be, there was one of me standing outside in the snow blowing a duck call saying, if you hunt ducks, this matters to you. And we had several of those different staff members participated in those. I'm sure I'm forgetting a bunch of stuff that we did. But the other track, so that's one track, right? That's the advocacy track. The other parallel track that we're doing here that we really want to stress to people about what they can do now is they need to get out and monitor. That's kind of the league's bread and butter. Obviously, we're in strange times right now, and so folks' ability to get out and do the SOS monitoring is a little compromised right now. Certainly, their ability to get trained or something like that. But we highlighted on the same webinar last week different ways that people can still get out and monitor and be safe. Things they can do on their own, monitoring, salt watch, all that stuff. So that's the other track here, is these waters are now going to be unprotected. So it's important. It's as important now as it ever has been for folks to get out and be, the eyes and the ears on the ground out there and monitor their local streams.
Great. Well, that's an uplifting wrap up. At least there is plenty that we can still do to help protect and advocate for our clean waterways. Thank you, Jared, so much for taking the time to give this presentation. I think it's an important issue and it can seem really complicated, but you've made it more clear to understand and sort of emphasize the importance of this ruling and how it affects all of us. So I want to give you a big thank you for that. And to all of our attendees, as I mentioned, this was recorded, so you'll hopefully get a link for the recording tomorrow, as well as some of these follow-up links that folks requested during the Q&A. Definitely tune in next week. So our webinar next week is about salt monitoring and salt in the water. So we'll be hearing from an expert researcher on the effects of excess salt on aquatic habitats, and also one of our community organizers who has a core of volunteers who really took charge in their local community to advocate for road salt usage changes and changing behavior in their local community. So with that, I want to thank you all for coming. Thank you again, Jared, and we hope to see you all next week for another Clean Water webinar.